Good evening and welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. My name is Johnny from Opus Independence, the social enterprise behind the Festival of Debate. This year's festival programme started on the 13th of April and runs all the way through to the 26th of May. It includes over 70 events, 150 speakers and 50 partners. The festival looks to explore the entangled ecological, economic and political crises we collectively face. There are no easy answers, but we hope the festival creates a space to explore and hold complexity and uncertainty and brings together a community of people to make change where they are. Most of our events are free at the point of access. Where we need to charge, we keep ticket prices as low as we can. If you would like to make a donation to the festival and are in a position to do so, you can do so by visiting the festivalofdebate.com website, which I will post in a link on the chat. A few housekeeping bits before we get tonight's conversation going. Drinks are available in your kitchen if you would like to go and grab one. The bathroom is where it usually is in your house, and there is no fire alarm planned this evening. So if you do hear something that sounds like one of those, we highly recommend investigating the reason behind it. On a slightly more useful note, the last thing I will mention before passing over to James is that we are on a Zoom webinar this evening, which if you haven't used before differs slightly from a Zoom meeting. It means that there is both a chat and a Q&A function. So if you would like to comment on what's being said or talk with other participants or introduce yourselves, you can do so using the chat function, which you should find as an icon at the bottom of your screen, or by pressing the three little dots on the right-hand side of the list of icons you have. If you would like to submit a question for the panel, which you can do at any point during the event, and we will get to them towards the end of the event, please use the Q&A section to do this. But without further ado, I will hand over to your host for the evening, James Locke.
Thank you, Johnny, and thank you everyone who has joined us to watch this session this evening, which is hosted in association with Sheffield Credit Union. My name is James Locke. I'm a director and co-founder at Opus, an organisation based in Sheffield dedicated to response making around the compounding crises that we collectively face. Thank you as well to our speakers tonight, who I'll introduce shortly: Indy Johar, Louisa Harrison-Walker, Stephen Porter and Helen Sims. Helen's kindly stepped in at short notice to replace Absam Mohammed this evening. My colleague Johnny will share some information in the chat with you all about these wonderful folk and the work they do. And if questions arise for you tonight, which I hope they do, please put them forward via the Q&A button. Also, for those of you that would like to, please also introduce yourself and where you're from in the chat. So the topic of tonight's exploratory session is an important one. How do we invest in city transitions and the people who live here? And I'd like to just set some context and some framing for this discussion. Our world, and indeed the city we live in, is changing rapidly. We face a landscape of problems which shape and are shaped by each other in real time. A landscape of problems which express themselves differently, not only across the world, but in different parts and communities of our very own city. We're living now with the impacts of increased scarcity as we surpass our planetary boundaries. Food prices have risen nearly 40%. Income inequality and its impacts on health and well-being are rife. And indeed, in Sheffield, we see the impacts of this geographically, with a 10-year life expectancy difference between those living in the northeast and those in the southwest. We face some hard realities and some hard decisions. Fundamentally, these decisions are about how we want to transform and transition our city over the next decade. I want to be clear that it's my view that Sheffield faces the choice not of whether to transform, not of whether to transition into a new economy, a new participative and caring civics, or a new relational understanding with the natural world around us, but whether to do this boldly and intentionally, or to do so in a disorderly and disjointed fashion. However, we face a challenge in this, which is that to lead and enable the change we need to implement as a city, We must find new capital flows, new forms of investment, new market making, and new coalitions and ways of working together. There's also something unique and animating about the city, indeed our city, as a unit of change, something I hope we'll explore tonight. Within this, the political and economic landscape is often orientated around short-term gain, short-term planning, and short-term visions of possibility. How do we shift this? What does that look like? What new capabilities and capacities are required of us all to live boldly and well into these challenges? So with those questions in mind, I want to welcome our speakers this evening. If you could all turn your videos on. Helen Sims, Chief Executive of Voluntary Action Sheffield. Stephen Porter, Head of Member Experience at Leeds Credit Union. Louisa Harrison Walker, Chief Executive of the Sheffield Chamber of Commerce. And Indy Johar, Co-founder of Dark Matter Labs. Because tonight is designed as an exploratory conversation, a conversation to begin to unpick and describe the possibilities of the future, I've invited all our speakers tonight to respond for 3 to 5 minutes or so to either or indeed both of these two provocations as they relate to the event topic tonight. So the provocations I've asked our speakers to respond to. What question is animating you most about the new capabilities or values that we need for investment in transition and the people who live here? What declaration of possibility can you make that has the power to transform the city for the people who live here and that inspires you? So tonight we'll begin with responses to these provocations from each of our speakers before moving into a discussion between you all and then Q&A. Who would like to kick us off? Indy, would you take the stage? Thank you.
Delighted, James. Thank you. That felt like a rhetorical. Who would you like? Firstly, delighted to be here. Delighted to be here and delighted to be in part of this conversation. So, firstly, thank you, and thank you to everyone that's here as well in the wider group. So, we often think of this as a marginal transformation, but it's not. What we're facing is probably the greatest investment in our places, probably equivalent to maybe post-war reconstruction, and if not, actually industrialization. It's of that order of magnitude that we're talking about. We're talking about having to electrify whole cities. We're talking about having to retrofit all of our homes. We're talking about having to increase biodiversity and build the tree canopies of our cities. We're talking about investing in our human development frameworks in a way that we've not done for maybe at least 2 decades, if not longer, to rebuild our human development capacity. We're talking about investing in our human health capacities in a way that we've not done for a while to build the mental health capacities of our societies. And these are all new types of assets. These are all new types of assets. They are not individual assets. They are collective assets. The collective intelligence of the city, the collective mental health of the city, the collective biodiversity of the city, the kind of electrification of the city, the air quality of the city. These are new types of civic assets and need radical investments. And I think one is just to recognize that this isn't like a marginal gain. Then the second question is, how do we do this in a way, and I'm going to use a word that I know carries a lot of baggage, but if you take the back, how do we do this financing not in a colonial way? And I don't mean colonial as in empire, I mean colonial as in top down, as in where capital structures actually the structures places, as opposed to people structuring places and capital acting as an enabler. So where the power moves not through financial capital, but moves through people. Because in democracies, this transition cannot be led by financial capital. It must be led by people if we're going to actually create the social legitimacy and the permission space for the scale of transformation that we're talking about. So how do we deploy capital in a completely different way? And that also requires us to recognize the particularities of place. So what is right for one place is different from rights of other places. And so that requires a kind of new theory of, and in my view, my provocation would be, we need a city development bank for Sheffield. We need a new type of, like credit unions were new types of institutions, building societies were new types of institutions. We need a new type of developmental institution that is actually constructed at the city scale, that is able to do these cities level investments, not in the quality of the local authority, but investing at a hybrid level across recognizing the entanglement of value. So if you invest in the tree canopy, you reduce your energy demands in terms of electrification. If you invest in the tree canopy, also you improve your health outcomes. If you invest in the human development capacity, you improve the actually economic development capacity of the whole city in different ways. And I think we have to recognize this scale. So also the other part is that, you know, if you took the S&P 100, and James, I will just shut up in literally a sentence more, but if you took the S&P 100 and you took 68% of the S&P 100, I believe is a stat, wouldn't make it through if they had to price social environmental costs. So I think we also have to recognize we're seeing a fundamental economic transition of our goods. You know, the analogy I use is our capital is focused on selling Coke, not apples. So Coke externalizes costs, builds addiction, externalizes carbon, ecological damage. A sustainable apple actually is generatively possible, but capital is focused on financing the development of Coke, not an apple, and a sustainable apple with sustainable capabilities in terms of soils and other things. So this is actually a recasting of our capital landscape, a decolonialization in terms of actually empowering people. Colonialism isn't just about foreign lands, it's actually about how we colonize ourselves and control. And this is about a new theory of liberation that has to be at the center of it. This requires a network, I think, of city regional development banks, and they are going to be a key part of that because they can do an integrated portfolio of that. They need to be financing the hybrid totality of the city, not just public versus private, because I don't think there's a public-private distinction when you look at it through an integrated lens. And I think it needs deep new legitimacy in its core design of participation in order to build the social legitimacy for this scale of change. And I think in that we can build the capacity for the transition that's required. And I think Sheffield's so well placed to have these sort of conversations because the quality of leaders that you've got already just in this meeting, let alone the other meetings I've been part of with you, with James. That's it.
Well, thanks, Indy. Always great to get a glimpse into your mind. So thank you for that. Right, I want to invite another speaker. Who would like to go next? Who's feeling that they've got something to go with? Helen, welcome.
I'll come in. Thank you. Thanks, Indy. I think following on from Indy's provocation, I think one of the key things for me is how do we ensure that citizen participation and agency is a headline in all this? Because for too long it's been a fringe event. You know, it currently is a fringe event. And what do we need to invest in to headline people's voice, participation? You know, where might we need to invest our energy, time, money? What might that look like as a city? So for me, the space and support for more collaborative conversations, wherever that is, you know, there's different ways of structuring that, but bringing different perspectives together, not just for extractive engagement processes, but for genuine valuing of, you know, diversity of views. So convening space that supports that. I think, where do we make sense of the city? You know, where do we do that on a regular basis? Where do we do that in places that people can access? I think the ability to make sense, I think, is also twinned with support around people's political education, understanding power, how it currently is, visioning our positionality as individuals in that. You know, we do not have time to reflect. I work in the voluntary community sector where you know, we are really starved of space to make sense of the future. But what I recognize is that there is, you know, massive power, diversity of thought, understanding. I think equally there is conflict and difference, and our ability as a group of citizens to navigate and, you know, confront conflict, you know, to talk and manage spaces where conflict can be drawn out is really key. You know, the complexity of things that we're talking about. and how we go on to make decisions, we need to have conversations that do mature into that space. Then how do we, as part of that investment, demonstrate the value of that participation and agency, you know, particularly in our governance structures, whether they're our political or organizational, institutional governance structures. My sense is if we're going to really make people and their agency a headline act, we will have to disrupt significantly how those governance structures work. I think Indy's already touched on this top down, you know, so how do we do that? Well, I feel we need to really look at our culture as a city. So institutionally, recognizing citizens equally. Much of our culture treats people as consumers, and then we become consumers in that governance that's treating people like consumers. Actually, how do we flip our thinking and our way of acting into active citizenship, ownership, responsibility, all of those things? And where might people drive us in that space? And I think, you know, cultivating space and people, whether that's through, you know, evolving kind of our ownership, I suppose, of space. So at a hyper local level, we can invest in community through the voluntary sector and through, you know, different infrastructure that brings people together, that can embrace and value difference, that can evolve our individual leadership within our lives, within our city, globally. And where might that lead us? For me, it might lead us towards owning our own assets. So I think if communities own more of the assets in a city, then we're more likely to value them rather than extract from them in the way that lots of things. I think that Coke versus Apple example is fantastic. It's a food product, but one fundamentally and economically extracts, the other one adds. And I think there's something about the space we own and how we can value it as individuals. So I think I'll finish there on that note.
Wonderful. Thanks, Helen. Stephen, Lou, you up? Let's go for it.
Yeah, I don't mind, or Stephen can go next.
No. Go for it.
Yeah, okay, smashing. Thank you. Well, thank you for having us. Yeah, from my perspective, I suppose there are sort of three strands of thought that are animating me. So really, I wanted to have the chance today to talk a little bit about business as a force for good, the power of giving power away, like Indy's kind of reference and Helen, and building on good practice. I noticed Johnny's putting stuff in the chat just to give context to kind of our perspective. So I'll not go into a huge amount of detail, but I ran my own business in Sheffield for 16 years, and obviously now I run the Chamber, and that's a membership organisation that looks after businesses, charities and social enterprises. And then I've sat on various boards throughout Sheffield, you know, Wheeler Hall Farm, the HEP board, South Yorkshire Housing. So I feel like the perspective I have is not just purely kind of private sector, which I think is helpful for this discussion, but obviously I want to bring that in as well. But, you know, business as a force for good, I think, you know, here in Sheffield, we've got a really rich history of philanthropy, difficult word to say, you know, with Graves and Mapping, and then modern day, you know, there are some amazing organisations, you know, Gripple, AES Seal, Wandisco. I think, like I said to you, James, there are more cooperatives and social enterprises in Sheffield than anywhere else in the UK, which is really interesting. And just the context in which we operate, you know, there are 16,000 economic entities in Sheffield. 96% of them are micro SMEs, so they employ 10 people or less. And I think that is quite unique to Sheffield, and that's a blessing and a curse. You know, good graduates often think that, you know, good jobs with big companies, so we tend to lose graduates at year kind of 2, 3. But it does mean we've got an incredibly agile base where they can be flexible and fleet of foot, and we saw that during the pandemic. We've got more employee ownership. You know, there's been a huge push on that. So we've got a lot of businesses that put, you know, doing good right at the very core. So hopefully we can talk a bit more about that. But the power of giving power away, I mean, Indy and Helen both referenced this, and I think something we need to do in this city is get better at disagreeing agreeably and having courageous conversations, and how we start to disrupt those traditional models of decision making where it's the same people in the same rooms. You know, a lot of the boards that I sit on, and I'd like to see that they were more representative of people with lived experience and diversity of thought. You know, what if the people that had the power to make the right, insightful decisions were actually given the power and given the resource, you know, rather than having things kind of done to them or done at them. And then finally, for me, I think there's definitely something about building on what's good that's here already. I think from my perspective, I've seen some amazing examples of collaboration and co-design that's happened since the pandemic. That was a real sort of catalyst in making people work together in a way that they hadn't before. So a really good example of that was the business recovery group, where public, private, voluntary sector, third sector all came together, and out of that came an economic recovery plan that went to cabinet and was approved, and a £2 million pot got set aside, which became the Economic Recovery Fund, where district centres in Sheffield were allowed to bid for money, and it was an iterative process. So I naively assumed that's how local authorities worked with communities, and until I was kind of on the inside of that, I was like, oh no, they don't. So there were some incredible things that came out of that, when people were given the power to say, this is what I want for my community area, and this would make the biggest difference to us. And then, as I say, it was iterative. So rather than, no, that won't work, it was back, forth, back, forth, back, forth. So there's about 20 projects all across Sheffield that you've seen that communities themselves have designed that have made huge differences to their locality. You know, Sheffield Business Together, that's a consortium that we have where charities can come to, and it's a brokerage that harnesses private sector resource. So, you know, the green fence that was done around the Hunters Bar School, Shirecliff Meadows Nursery, was finished as a result of the private sector leaning in and making that happen. And the Levelling Up Futures in Sheffield project, where Sheffield Hallam, the council, the chamber all work together to work in the most deprived schools across Sheffield, and kind of provide careers education and world of work visits and mentoring. You know, what if great examples were more widely shared and showcased? You know, would they snowball? You know, does change start with a small step and an individual, and then, you know, becomes a bigger thing? And I just wanted to finish for me on a quote from The Boy, the Mole, the Fox and the Horse, which is a book that I read with my little boy. Because as I was preparing for this, you can become so overwhelmed with how much needs to change, and, you know, how much there is to bite off, and, you know, how do you eat an elephant? And I was the part in the book where the storm is there and he's completely overwhelmed and he can't see the destination and he doesn't know where to go. And the horse says, well, can you see the next step? Then just take that and the horizon will take care of itself. And I think sometimes we can be in danger of trying to bite off too much, and actually just choose, you know, take the next step, bite-sized chunks, and then I think the good things will flow. So that was my thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you, Lou. Wonderful. Absolutely brilliant. Stephen, last but not least, welcome.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. My background's very much in the financial sector, the sort of last 15, 20 years working in what would traditionally be called non-standard, so looking at those areas that are underserved. I was going to start by saying money makes the world go round, but having listened to the three previous responses, it's much more than that, isn't it? You know, money is still a facilitator because it allows and enables things to happen. But it can't be about money making money. It cannot be the same traditional ways we've done things. And I think for me, the thing that exercises me is how do we create and build a better financial ecosystem, one that helps our communities, one that supports and accelerates the sort of transformation and transition that people have been talking about. For me, it's how do we bring those together? I'm fortunate enough to have seen some examples in Sheffield and surrounding areas. There are capabilities there, but they're small. They're often not known or unheard of. I mean, you talked about credit union. Sheffield's got a credit union. It's got community development sort of finance institutions, initiatives going on that support micro businesses, but again, not well known, very fragmented. So coming together, creating a collective power is something that I'm really interested to see how that works. How do we bring businesses in? How do we bring the local authorities in to help and support and create that momentum for change? You know, I mentioned the credit union, but credit unions are not-for-profit organisations. They're they're cooperative, they're member owned, they think differently. And I think if we can get more people to think differently, where the decisions that are made are not focused on financial returns, but actually on social good, social benefits, health benefits. As I said, I kind of work in the sector, and the number of case studies that we have where helping somebody to build financial resilience as an individual or as a business has immeasurable benefits, health benefits, economic benefits, and people pay on. So when people have experienced and benefited from things, they will tend to pay that forward. And I think, again, that's incredibly powerful. So for me, that's kind of, how do we create a joined up collaborative approach that thinks a bit differently? In a way, the previous sort of 3 responses scare me a little bit. This is a big subject. Eating the elephant, boiling the ocean. I think it's almost, how do you make little changes? I've been quite fortunate working with a number of local authorities where the conversations, there's no answer yet, is around trying to change some of the ways things are done. I have to say, some of it's a bit too prescriptive, and I love this idea of getting our communities involved and democratizing and empowering people more than happens today. But how to make money work a little bit harder? How do you move from grant to loan if it's got a social value? And because that money then gets recycled back in, you can use it once. If it's got value and benefit, it might take 40 years to repay, but at least the money recycles back and you can help somebody else. For me, that's it. But there's a lot to do. It's quite frightening, but already a lot of provocation.
Thank you, Stephen. And I think, expressing the terror of it is really, really important, right? We have to hold that space. That's a really important space, because it enables us to acknowledge the difference between our kind of real politic of the status quo to the real life of where we actually are. And Lou, reflecting on what you were saying about the pandemic, and what's the phrase? Changes the necessity of the mother invention. Where am I going with that? You know what I'm saying? We come up with stuff, don't we? We come up with stuff when we have to. We can, although I'm slightly nervous about this phrase, eat the elephant. It feels slightly out of key, but I'm up for it. Okay, so we can do stuff. It is possible, and more importantly, it's stuff that needs to be done. I just want to open up. You've all heard from each other. What moved you? Does someone have any questions? Anything they'd like to expand on?
I think I've probably got a question for the panel. As you know from my bio, I work with Leeds Credit Union, but this is not uncommon. We have a volunteer board. That volunteer board is remarkably undiverse, and in so many ways, in terms of experience, in terms of economic power. And I just wonder, for this to really work, we have to get more people, the phrase, politicized in the right way. And I'm just wondering if anybody's got any good examples of how that's happened.
How to bring people in? A good question. Yeah. Anybody got any thoughts on that before? I see, Andy, you've got your hand raised. You're welcome. Come in. Hello.
I'll have a go at that. I think how to bring people in. I think about why you're bringing people in and why they would want to be brought in. There's something about kind of a shared value, and like, I have a board. We've done some recruitment, but we've done that quite slowly. And I think, the future board of my organization, I think, will probably look very, very differently, but not overnight. It will be because of the work we're doing and the shift in how we're approaching things will attract different people. So it's like a fundamental shift in our focus, but it like really values led, and yeah, investing in people. So in the same way that I invest in volunteers and staff in my organization, you know, that they are the succession plan for the sector, and yeah, just wanting to value the assets that people bring, but fundamentally just an alignment of values and an understanding of why we want to be there.
Thanks, Helen. Indy, you've had your hand up for a few moments. Welcome.
Yeah, no, I think there's a couple of things. I suppose one thing would be radical honesty. I slightly worry that we're often creating soft lies, like if we do these small things, it's all going to be okay. And actually people can feel it's off. They can feel it's wrong. They feel the fact that a can of Coke selling for 99 pence actually is sort of cheaper than a bag of apples. They can feel it's wrong, right? And I think there's a kind of structural dishonesty that's visible to people. And I think we need to be more radically honest for people to buy into our organizations and buy into this process of change. And I think this goes directly in the face of kind of the conversations we've been having for the last 20 years, is let's not scare the horses. I think everyone just doesn't believe it anymore. That's the kind of like, the best quote, this was in Sheffield, I think somebody walked over to me, said, Indy, I didn't understand every word you said, but you put words into what I was feeling. I think if people can feel it's wrong at a fundamental level, the fact that a tree is a liability, right, in accounting terms, a street tree is a liability, is understood as a problem. They can see its value, but they know our accounting structures don't understand its value. We can perceive health as a value, but actually we perceive it as a cost, as in our accounting structures framework. We can perceive. So I think there's a kind of radical honesty that needs to be on the table. And I do think that radical honesty needs to be matched by a new piece of courage, a courage of like when we built the NHS, well, we were able to do large scale things. This is not going to be a smooth transition. Remember this year, 40% increase in people's food bills. There's nothing smooth about this. There's nothing like, oh, it just kind of happened. You know, construction cost has gone up 200% in some parts of the world in terms of actually timber material construction. So I think for me, radical honesty is the way to actually onboard people to the kind of nature of the conversation. And that does require, like Helen, you were saying, sensing and sense making together with citizens as to this future, not it being imposition, but building a shared sense and a shared sense making of this future. And to that, there's structural legitimacy. And then it requires structural reform. We have to reimagine the public balance sheet. The public balance sheet, the materials of a city should be on the balance sheet of the city. The health of a city should be on the balance sheet of the city, not the municipality, but the city itself. We have to value things differently. The ecological assets of a city should be on the balance sheet of the city. So unless we start to value things differently, then we have to talk about new capabilities in a fundamentally different way. So I kind of feel like actually we've kind of got to go a little bit all in. Like we've got to embrace the scale and embrace the thing, because I think that's the only way, because otherwise we're going to be literally, I mean, unfortunately, I hate the term, but killed by 1,000 cuts, but we're slowly being undermined. And I think with the loss of courage is so significant as a result of it. And I think there's courage required, and it's the courage of embracing our own possibility and our capability to build this. And I do think, I mean, this is going to be slightly scary, but I think we're looking at like a industrial extinction level event of our economy, where vast amounts of our economy is not viable in the future. So how do we, I remember we've done this, like after World War, there was work done to rebuild our economy. And I think the next government has to come in structurally to talk about rebuilding our economy from grassroots level into a new economy, which isn't self-terminating us, which isn't effectively externalizing carbon, which isn't externalizing plastic pollution, which isn't building these kind of externalities, which are literally self-terminating us. So if that's the case, that's going to require actual, real structural reform, but also partnerships between local government, municipalities with central government, and actually talking about these transition capabilities in a structural sense. And I think Sheffield should be calling out, it's not just a levelling up fund, it's actually a transition that's required at a much deeper level, and we have to build those capabilities, and we have to build them not in the industrial sense, not in the same way of how we did the 1960s rebuild of our cities and 70s rebuild of our cities. It has to be done in a deeply participatory way with a new theory of community civic organizing at the back end of that. And I think for me, I kind of want to lean into it rather than lean back from it. I want to have a different type of conversation. And my gut feeling, and again, festival debate has been brilliant for this. Like, I remember sitting there going, everyone used to tell me, Indy, thanks, mate, but can you just leave this for Whitehall conversations? And actually, normal people get these conversations. They feel it in their bones. And I think we have to have these conversations. So I'm so glad we're having this type of conversation here, because I think because people feel it in their bones, we don't need to placate people. Actually, it's the honesty that unlocks the capacity of the conversation. So anyway, sorry, a little bit of a...
Thank you, Indy. Thank you very much. Lou, I think you were first up, so over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, just responding to Stephen's request for thoughts on sort of diversifying boards. I don't know how to take my hand down now, by the way, but I'll work that out. But yeah, Stephen, from my perspective, so when I first got involved with Sheffield Chamber, it was about a decade ago. There were 2 women on the board, that was it, and I was the first female chair they had in 157 years. And I think I like what Indy said about radical honesty, is that sometimes you've got to be honest with people and say, you might be the first person in the room and it might be really uncomfortable. And I can't promise that what you're going to meet is going to meet your expectations in terms of, behaviours and all of that. Because I had a lot of that when I first kind of came in and I had to upset the apple cart. But now, a decade on, it's a completely different organisation. The council, the board is a really eclectic mix across all spectrums of diversity. And I'm really proud of that, but it wasn't easy. It takes work and it takes effort. A great example, one of the boards I sit on, South Yorkshire Housing Association, 2 of their board members were actually customers, service users. And I find that so brilliant, because you've always got them saying, but how's that going to affect us? And how would that affect the customer? And often the rooms I sit in, there isn't a service user or a customer on the board. And so that perspective gets lost. But I'll just give a really practical example. My husband works for a massive firm and they were looking for an apprentice. And they put an advert out, had no responses. It's noisy out there. Everybody wants trustees, volunteers, employees, all of that. I read the advert and I was like, it's so uninspiring. Who wrote that? And it was somebody in their 50s that, right, if you're looking for an apprentice, you need the right person to talk to that audience. How many apprentices have you got in the business? There's thousands. Get one of them to write the advert. So first and foremost, recognise what you don't know. And that's okay to say, if I go out for somebody in my networks and in my language, I'm going to attract somebody similar to me. So how do I make sure that I'm talking in a different voice and that I'm putting that out into the places where the people are? And I just think, yeah, I like what Indy said about sort of, yeah, absolute radical honesty about what you need and what the request is and what people might be met with when they get there. But ultimately, like Helen says, people will buy into the values if you frame the story right about the purpose. But it's noisy out there. It's very, very competitive. And it's being a trustee, you don't get paid, you're a non-exec director, and it's a lot of time commitment. And so it is a big ask of people. You've got to frame it and warm people up, and it can take a bit of time. So that'll be my feedback to you.
Helen, I think you were next, and then Stephen after you.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on the theme and a lot of the language that we're using in all of this, which is quite visceral, and it's about trusting your instincts, like, what you're seeing and hearing and how that connects to your reality. I think over the last year, I've certainly been listening, particularly when you have those big kind of gut wrench moments. That's really, you need to hold on to that for the change that we're facing, actually, and channel that, because it's kind of that feeling that you need to keep revisiting when it's so tempting to get drawn back into traditional structures. And you can just keep ploughing the furrow that we're in, but you actually need to physically, I think, feel the need for change. And I think, we've been doing some work in my organisation around working with food aid. Essentially, it's part of the food access plan and kind of a strategy, but we've been working in the kind of food aid structure in the city. And for me, there's something about fulfilling that role is about supporting a network, which is really, really important. But it felt to us like instinctively that perhaps we weren't centering that work in the right place. We were doing crisis response, but we felt instinctively that there was a bit of a kind of playbook playing out in how we were thinking about food, and we were fulfilling the food aid part because we're the voluntary community sector. And actually it felt that we had a greater scope in this space, and it is all part of food justice, but we've really shifted how we're working in that space, and we're moving towards kind of more community organizing models around food and wanting to shift that work, which is essentially kind of commissioned of us, but we're finding our power within it. So there's just something about, I think very often when you're working with people, it's easy to say what something's not than what it is. So if you kind of say this work is not about this, then it helps you to kind of unleash some curiosity about where you might need to go to find the new solutions and find the new connections that you need. So it's just something about that, how you lead in that space and what it feels like. It feels very different, and it feels very physically quite challenging actually, because you're holding that feeling.
Thanks, Helen. And Stephen.
Oops, just losing my camera. Well, first of all, thank you, because that was quite helpful and thought-provoking. I mean, one of the things that I've seen work really well, and we're trying to do is get member participation through forums. Hopefully, that's a step into them joining the board. So regular conversations with them about what's good, what's not good, what do they want. But I wanted to come back actually again, Indy, you're provoking a lot of thought. This idea of reimagining the balance sheet for me is absolutely critical. We'll be doing some work with residents in one of the London boroughs, again around this idea of how do we get homes to be more energy efficient, how do we get them to be energy sustainable, and ultimately all the barriers seem to come down to this almost traditional payback. You know, it's 20 years before my capital investment actually breaks even, and most people don't think about that, and the people that provide the finance don't think about that broader piece. And I think if we can reimagine at that level the real value that you can get from an air pump or solar panels or electric cars, or Sheffield generating its own energy, we'll go back to putting wheels on the Rivelin, because that generates energy. If we can think about that balance sheet differently, I think the progress could be quite phenomenal.
Just James, just coming on that, I think I think you're absolutely right. So, for example, there's the energy benefits of retrofit, right, which is about 40%. There's the social, what I would call the social benefits, which can be, and the health benefits in terms of actually energy poverty and other issues, which can be another 30-35%. And then there is actually the economic benefits, which is actually the job creation, the kind of multiplication of those job creation, the GVA that's created at the city scale. So you can suddenly start to create what I would call the transaction level benefits, the spillover benefits, and then the monetary benefits. Now, those benefits can only be structured at certain scales, and they can only be structured when you do it at the city scale. So can there be a kind of a sort of Devo Max deal, which looks at the kind of gross GVA benefit? Now, how do you do that centered on people, not through top-down allocations, but actually supporting communities to do that in a different way? So we've been looking at street level retrofits, where communities actually are given the generative capacity to be able to make the right decisions for their neighborhoods in different formats. So how do you finance that in different ways becomes really key. So you're absolutely right. And I think we have to talk about multi-balance sheet systems, so multiple beneficiaries, but also multiple capitals. So a tree which is planted by communities has a 90% chance of survival versus a tree planted by local authorities, which is a 50% chance of survival. So actually that's because care becomes a key part of that relationship. So you have to talk about multiple currencies, multi-currency business models, which actually recognize the value of care in the system. And that, we don't have the current procurement pathways for public civic procurement in a really meaningful way. But if we can do that, we can start to construct those multi-currency, multi-beneficiary systems. So those are some ways, and they do re-engineer the conversation about the kind of public balance sheet as well, if we can really start to think about those in those frameworks. So we know materials. So if you look at the material economy of cities, I think we're not going to be able to import the material that we've been talking about. So the biggest kind of constraints on whole city retrofit, and any of these retrofit scenarios, is both material costs and also labor costs. So when we start to think about the materiality of the city will itself become a kind of a key balance sheet of the city. So how do you actually recycle that material, recirculate it? How do you make the incentives for new materials that are used to be highly circular? How do you build material registries with differential accounting on every one of those materials, which means that actually you incentivize that circularity of materials in the economy? Those become critical components. So I think you're absolutely right. There is a kind of different accounting structure, as well as a balance sheet structure and a benefit structure that's really key part of this transition story. And I think that starts to create the foundations for, I think, a new economy and a new business. And this is why I going back to one of the questions, I think this is about for a whole new set of businesses and enterprises to rebuild. This is why a human development investment is critical, as well as the energy, as well as the kind of biodiversity, as well as the kind of material transition. Then we have to talk about a human development transition, because that creates the foundations for a new economy. So what is the collective intelligence of a city? How is that becoming a new asset of the city? And that's not a divisible asset. It can't be owned by you or I. It's a collective asset. It's a commons asset. But we need to be able to invest in it, to be able to create the economy of the next generation of businesses and enterprises that are going to be the platform for it. So I think we have to recognize this isn't about changing Coke to lemonade. It's not that side of the business story. It's actually deep into the foundations of our economy and society as a whole, and also how we make decisions together. What is our framework of societal decision making is really critical. So I just wanted to articulate that, and I think you're absolutely right to talk about this balance sheet question. So these sort of nuts and bolts, and remember, we've coded these balance sheets. We can uncode them and recode them, and we will have to be able to recognize the multi-currency benefits, the kind of care capital of communities, as a key part of that story. If we value it, we'll care for it. If we measure it, we'll value it, and we'll actually recognize it as a multi-currency system, which I think is really fundamental. And it's not an option. Like I say, trees survive longer. They are cared for. They have a value as a result of recognizing that care capital as well as that financial capital in different ways.
Thank you, Indy. I'm just picking up on a question that we've had, which is around how do we finance the transition and the kind of function of current pots of money, and a sense of needing to fund something outside of a traditional growth agenda. The need to, how do we finance non-growth based transition work? And I think to some extent, Indy, you've kind of covered that by saying we effectively need to revalue things, and we need to revalue things with a sense of their relational web. But I wonder, in the short term, if panelists have views about how do you shift the political discourse to inspire that deep revaluing, or secondly, where are you kind of hedging your bets, I suppose, in the catalyst funding into this space, let's call it that, in terms of public investment, private investment, or philanthropic investment? So just open that question up. I don't know if anybody has thoughts about either of those two. Okie dokie.
I can come in if no one wants to.
Well, it's the question of the day, isn't it, really? But yeah, indeed.
I'll spearhead, and then I'll hopefully create a way for other people to give better answers. So I think there's several aspects of that question which I think are really important. I think, firstly, in many ways, you could argue we're living in degrowth right now. So where our net economic growth is less than the externalities we're generating into society as a whole, right? So the externalities, unpriced externalities into society, is greater than the growth that we have in our society. If you took social environmental costs onto the table, we're living in degrowth. Second thing, I would say we are about to move into forced degrowth of our material economy, forced degrowth. And that's, you're already seeing it, material price inflation, You're already seeing it in food price inflation, inequality. We're being forcing degrowth function. And the third thing I would say is this is where what do we value becomes really important. You know, why I was talking about care capital, collective intelligence, these new forms of intangible assets become really critical is if we value intangible assets, then we can start to actually talk about an economy that moves from material goods and to actually immaterial intangible goods, which actually create the frameworks of these developments. And we have to create the frameworks for actually the circularity of our materials. We know we're going to have to move our material economy to make it massively durable, massively circular, massively biomaterial based. That will take 30 years to do. We will then have to move our economy to be greater intangibles driven, both care and virtual augmented realities and other things will become a key part of our economy as we move our economy to intangibles. So I think this is a hybrid question, and it's going to take, and we're going to have to build it on biomaterial circularity. So, you know, Sheffield is very well placed to be able to build this biomaterial base and be able to grow that, but that will take time. We're going to have to rebuild our food economy to make it deeply more nutritious. So this is a systemic transformation at every one of those layers that is both an opportunity, but also a regearing of everything that we, you know, currently our food is mostly degrowth. It's not actually, it's net energy endothermic. So food consumes more energy to make than it does provide us, which is the first time in history, because given the sun gives us quite a lot of free energy. Our food is not actually deeply nutritious. There is a nutrition deficit in our food and it's declining. So how do we build the nutrition density of our food? It's largely an addictive purpose, sugar and salt driven. It's usually a kind of addictive tool as opposed to a health. It should be treated like a pharmacy in a way, kind of pun the word pharmacy in a good way. So how do we start to build these things in a deep way? And I think that's a great opportunity. This is why I sit here with kind of hope, because I think these are all on our balance sheets, which we can improve. And that's where we can move from, I think what we're living in is a degrowth economy to a genuinely new growth economy, which recognizes those externalities and start to build deep, true growth, which is actually a developmental opportunity and moves us away from the systemic sort of malgrowth that we're seeing, and also moves us into a new intangibles economy, which is also going to be critical. So I think these things are all on the table, and I think they're all possible in these sort of conversations. And the other thing I'd say is it's remarkable we're having this sort of conversation, and I don't think this sort of conversation, you know, we need to be having more of these sort of conversations about what this transition really feels like and operates like. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. We've had another question in the chat. Oh, Stephen, go for it.
Yeah, again, just kind of building on that, you know, I think one of the challenges we face is how do we nudge ourselves away from the addictions we've got, you know, and those addictions are, you talked about it, sort of, you know, minimal nutritional foods, cheap food, you know, importing lamb from New Zealand and not bringing it down from the Peak District. All of that kind of stuff is kind of behavioural nudges that we've got to start to move in the right direction. It's just raising another question, no answer, just another question. And how do we turn that into the mass rather than the, if you like, those people that have got a little bit more money, feel good, can do that, can go to the farm shop. How do we make that the mass so that that's where Morrison's and Asda and Tesco are stocking from?
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I mean, there's some structural sort of income and
Stephen,
sorry, Andy. Go for it.
I think there's a little bit of a lag, James. That was why that was. But I was just going to say that, Stephen, can I reframe it as expensive food that's disguised as cheap food? It's actually quite expensive. Just the expense isn't at the unitary cost level of somebody buying it, but actually at a societal level, it's very expensive food. Like, you know, I would say most burgers and everything is actually societally very expensive. It's just priced at a unitary level, which is cheap or makes it look cheap. Sorry, I just wanted to play with that. And I think it's just because then we can build a common parlance around that.
Yeah, I'd agree 100% with you.
I think it's interesting that the conversation comes back often to the kind of discourse, how are we talking to people about the importance of work in this space? How are we moving institutions And I think it's interesting to see the example in the Q&A coming out here around the Sheffield Clean Air Zone. And it's an if you kind of viewed it as a question about how best to engage in the changes to come, would you pick Clean Air Zone as your kind of starting point, I suppose? And there might be lots of reasons why you would, but part of the discourse around the Clean Air Zone is also really, really important. And people here in the Q&A say, is it an opportunity to engage people in the questions of how do we invest in transitions, because it is a revenue generating model, the Clean Air Zone. And another person saying it's a good example. The objectives seem right, where the intention seems right, but the public reaction to it has been almost entirely negative. And that again spills into this gap about realpolitik and real life, which is a kind of theme for me at the moment. I wondered if panelists had any response or any thoughts on any of that.
Yeah, about the Clean Air Zone, I think it is a really interesting example of where people feel like something's been done to them rather than with them, because we were involved in some of the early consultations where the council had to kind of liaise with various stakeholders to let people know what was happening. We didn't have a choice about that Clean Air Zone. Like, we had to implement it. It wasn't something that the local authority could decide, because we were in breach of the, I think, statutory guidelines and regulations, and so we had to implement it. But it's comms, isn't it? Because you wouldn't know that. And you drive down, I live about 4 miles out of town, and as you drive, you know, the signs say Clean Air Zone charges may apply. Some of my friends are like, well, does that apply to me? What does that mean? And so you can understand why there's been so much negativity around it. And I think all of it comes back to communication and taking people with you on the journey. So sometimes we will have to make decisions that will not be popular, but as long as people understand why that decision has been made, sometimes people can get on board with it. But yeah, it's difficult to take people along the journey with every decision, isn't it?
And so, Lou, what's the radical honesty version for you?
What, with the Clean Air Zone?
Yeah.
Well, we do need it, don't we? We need to improve the air quality in this city. The radical honesty position for me is our public transport infrastructure is not sufficient enough to encourage people to leave their cars behind. And the active travel network, I know we're getting there and we're working on that. We've got Ed Clancy, the new active travel commissioner. Would I cycle into work on some of our key roads? I know we've got some shocking statistics, haven't we? Sheffield for accidents and incidents with cyclists. So, you know, and we're going to have a similar debate, aren't we, when it comes to the red lines on Ecclesall Road? You know, and the consultation around that is we have to start moving to we have to move away from the dependence on car travel, because it's not good for our environment. But it's that nudge, isn't it? Path of least resistance. How do you make it easy for people to do that? And if you've got a really great bus, tram, travel, train network infrastructure that gives people a viable alternative, it's a lot easier for people to do that. But as a region, our transport infrastructure has been significantly underinvested in for decades. And that's a real problem.
I guess I just wonder, maybe, Helen, this is a good provocation for you, but I guess I just wonder what the difference between the kind of radical honesty that Lou's just described, which is essentially acknowledging the complexity in that landscape of decision making. What's the difference between comms and radical honesty? You know, you work a lot with communities, Helen. How would you think about that?
I think the honesty just starts with, so yeah, the comms feels like the delivery of a decision, of a strategy. You know, this is a statutory duty, isn't it? It's a statutory duty. Our local authority need to execute it. Then they have a comms plan for how they will talk to us about it. The radical honesty is a conversation that's ongoing in the city about the reality of the quality of our air and how people are dying prematurely. You know, it's kind of bringing in real examples of impact on health, what that looks like. For me, there's a parallel with the food work we're doing and the levels of obesity, and then the fact that there are food deserts, and then, you know, working in that space, I'm able to make some sense of how our food supply is driven by probably 5 or 6 big corporations, essentially, who are selling us food that is pretty harmful. And then when you look into it a bit more and you start talking to people about things like my local supermarket is increasingly just stocking sugary food because it's by a school, and clearly its matrix system is doing that because kids are coming in and buying sugary pop and sugar, and that's all it supplies now. And then you kind of look into, well, there's some kind of policy and government about legislation about what supermarkets can and can't do, but it's pretty weak and they work around it regularly. And so you start looking into that, and that's the truth. Like, your local supermarket is just pushing you what they want to push you. Once you see that, you can't unsee it, really. And you start to actually think about, well, what are my other options here? Because this is pretty rubbish. So I think that's kind of the parallel with the clean air zone. It's like, you know, what's the truth of this? What's really happening? And how does it impact on people? Can we tell some stories about this, please? Because facts and figures and all that stuff doesn't do it, but real human stories do convey some of these messages. So I kind of think it's in that space.
I really love that phrase there, once you unsee it, once you see it, you can't unsee it. I think that's an absolutely critical component of any shift in public or political discourse. And I think it's interesting to think about how you create that experience. I'm just going to move us over to the Q&A, because we've had a really great question here from Rachel. What is the importance of scale here, particularly given the urgency of these transitions? We've spoken about hyperlocal, but also meso-level, regional, even combined authority, though the combined authority have a distinct lack of political autonomy and resources, etc. So the question really around how you join up across scales there. But then after that, she also says, how can we transform our governance system for all that is required? So there's a question about that governance relationship between those scales there, which I think is a really excellent question. Anybody got any thoughts about that? Indeed.
I'll frame it, and then hopefully other people can come in. I think the governance question is to situate it as a top-down problem, whereas I think what we have to talk about is, you know, whole street retrofits, whole neighborhood retrofits, and those, as you do those retrofits, just use them as a retrofit as an example, it has relationships to different parts of that governance story. You know, the public health story sits at one level, the kind of energy story sits at another level, the kind of social costs at another level, the economic benefits at another level. But the action has to be actually bottom up, and the relationships has to be with different, rather than actually imagining coordination from the top down is what we need. So I think we have to create the sovereignty of power and agency. The democracy is not the democracy of the vote, but the democracy of agency. And we have to talk about a great civic rebuild as a framework that comes up. And I think if you see one district doing it, how do you help another 5 districts to do that? So you build an emergent framework, which is then enabled by those different layers rather than actually led by those layers down. So that would be my hypothesis of the scale, because I think legitimacy is the number one question. Government has put in millions of pounds, were set aside for retrofit. People didn't take the money because they didn't trust the process, didn't trust what was required. So it's not about allocation of capital, it's not about top-down schemes, it's about how you create the civic buy-in and the civic trust at a bottom-up level, and then tie that up with different relationships and building the sense-making capacities of citizens and societies to be able to understand what's required, the benefit of the clean air zone. It's not about the zone, it's about the right to clean air, and the right to clean air for your children and the impact it has on your educational performance and the health outcomes it has, the right that even if you're sitting in a car, you have really crappy air. indoor air quality is 5 times worse than outdoor air quality. So actually it's building the sense-making capacity is what we have to invest in, the sensing and sense-making capacity to create the Overton windows for the different layers to operate and coordinate. So I would really go bottom up there, recognizing the roles of every one of those agencies could be facilitators and critical, but actually not imagine them leading it, because I don't think that's where we're going to have to be able to create the legitimacy around this. I think there's a kind of framework, it's an enabling framework.
Thank you. And you once told me an astonishingly bleak fact about the carbon requirements for retrofitting, which is something that I can't unhear. So maybe you could share that with everybody else so that they too also can't unhear it.
Well, I mean, it just is a simple thing, which is to say that if the UK, with the Paris Accord, we've signed up to the Paris Accord, under the Paris Accord, we can afford to build 14,000 homes a year. 14,000 homes a year. We have a national target of 300,000. And if we do any retrofit, those 14,000 homes come down. So it's not 40,000 and the retrofit, it's 40,000 minus. So actually what we're not reconciling on one hand what we've signed up to with the reality of what this really means in terms of the transition of our economies and societies. And I think this is where this stuff becomes really serious and important. But yeah, sorry.
Thank you indeed. I look forward to dreaming about that later. Okay, so we've got 20 minutes left for tonight. So I just want to encourage all the people listening to get your questions in on the Q&A. Thank you to those of you that have already. Stephen, I wanted to ask you about something you mentioned to me a few days ago, which was around the work that you've been doing with local authorities and thinking about the role of local authorities in terms of that kind of financial support for new financial products or services. And also, I guess, wanting to name that it linked in a little bit for me with something you said, Lou, about de-risking some of these small and medium-sized enterprises to take part in some of this transition work. And I just wondered if there was an interesting kind of link there to explore. So, Stephen, maybe you could share a little bit about that, and then we could see where it leads us.
Yeah, not quite sure which example, but I think local authorities have got a big role to play. You know, over the last couple of years, I've worked quite closely with a credit union, Leeds Credit Union. And one of the key challenges of any organisation that's small is they're limited in the risk they can take, because effectively they're funded by their members and it's their members' money that they're using. So I think there are a few good examples where local authorities have, at a very micro level, have helped local communities get out of difficulties through almost guaranteeing how best to position it. So the Wakefield local authority had got a problem in a couple of areas where loan sharks were prevalent. They were quite deprived areas, and they were a real problem. And you can imagine, you know, somebody borrows £50, they're paying back £1,000. It's that kind of scenario. But as a credit union, although they say yes to a number of people, they can't say yes to everybody, and they can't get down to that £50. So working with the local authority, we found a way of saying yes to those people, and just on a small scale, that brought up the community, because you forced out a predator. Kind of a similar thing that we're doing at a very micro level around social impact, again down in London, where we're helping those coming out of the care system with sort of financial inclusion, financial products. Again, it's something that is supported and funded by the local authority, and what it's doing is getting people, to be, economically active, giving them confidence, helping the health, so getting them into into accommodation, helping them to create structures around paying their rent and paying their bills, helping them get into employment. And all of that creates a positive impact in the community. And I think it's just those little things that could be and should be scaled up.
And implicit in that, I think, is some degree of flexibility. And I think if the nature of the challenges that we've described ahead are even partway true, we're going to need a more flexible and more value orientated financial investment program, aren't we?
Yeah. Sorry, James. I think probably the one thing I would say is the things that have worked really well are those things where the problem has been identified and the key stakeholders, and that includes the individuals that have been we're trying to help, are involved in the collective design of the solution. And that is really, really important. Because and I come from a very traditional financial services background where I've designed things and forced them on the public. That doesn't work. The best way for it to work, particularly when you're talking about very specific problems, particularly in deprived communities, is listen to the issue and work with them on the solution.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Yeah. Definitely coming out for me there, that need for collective co-design of these things, that need to do things at different scales. And I guess also, perhaps if I'm not reaching too much, a sense of confidence that potentially local authorities could bring into financial products that might be required for transition. Anybody else got any thoughts on that? We've got 5 more minutes before I'm going to bring us to final comments. So just opening that up again. Okay. Stephen.
Yeah, kind of just an observation for me, and I think we've talked about how do we democratise, how do we get people engaged. I think one of the other things that's really important here, a lot of this is going to, it's fundamental change and will take time. So you have to take it away from the political 4 or 5 year cycles of voting in people. So I think, again, it makes it so important that this is driven at community and bottom up level, where people have got a stake in this, are passionate about the outcomes, and will see it through.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I was really struck by what Indy said about civic minds and civic trust. I think the most heartwarming thing for me during the pandemic was, although there was a load of stuff coming top down and central government and policies and process and stuff out of the local authorities and Simca and so on, it was the little note that came through my door from the mutual aid that said, if you need anything, here's a mobile number, we'll pick up prescriptions, pick up food. And yeah, that power of community, it's that whole, if it is to be, it's up to me. I found it really challenging in the last 3 years working with a government that the behaviours that come out that are driven as a result of needing to be popular or get re-elected, it's been incredibly challenging. And as we've seen in the last 12 months, just the amount of change in personnel. And so for me, whilst I don't want to be defeatist about, how do you have a significant change in the structure and the system, I'm watching Bridgerton at the moment and just looking back to, it goes all the way back though, doesn't it? We've always had, governments in those positions, and who are they there for? Who are they acting in the best interests of? And we have this conversation a lot in this region about nobody's coming over the hill to save us. No one's coming on horses. It's up to us if we want to sort it out. And so I think there is something about getting organised from the ground up and taking it into our own hands. And we know we can do it because we did do it during the pandemic. And on a basic human level, people wanted to help each other. And I think it's coming back to that core of at its heart, people are good and people are kind and people want to help each other. And that's really where, like Mother Teresa says, isn't it? If you want to change the world, go home and love your family, you know?
Thank you, Lou. Yeah, wonderful. We've had a slightly arcane, I hope that's not too offensive, question here. How helpful are systems like TOMS as a framework for tracking social value that we're creating in towns and cities? Is it helping? So are our frameworks for tracking social value helping us? I guess my kind of sense of that is around, are they tracking the relational value between impacts or not? And if not, perhaps not, given the conversation we've had. But does anybody have any use TOMS or aware of TOMS on this call? Or have any comment on social value frameworks? Okay, I'm sensing no, so apologies, anonymous attendee. That's not one we can answer tonight. But Indy, yeah, go for it.
So generally, I'm not a big fan of impact frameworks of any type. Now, what that, you know, so what I'm really more and more interested in is who are the liability owners. So, for example, if you increase the flooding risk as flooding risk is increasing pretty much everywhere across Europe, or certainly UK, if the flooding risk increases, there's a cost to that flooding risk. That's borne by the water utility companies, it's borne by the mortgage holders, it's borne by the landowners. Actually, you can look at it in terms of resilience costs, sort of all sorts of other costs in the system. So more and more what I'm interested in is how do you understand those risks that are held in the system and how do you match those risks? So if you build a tree canopy or a nature-based kind of or green solution for sort of biodiversity solution as an alternative to grey infrastructure solution, how does that mitigate those liabilities in different formats? So I'm less and less interested in what I would call, you know, put $1 here, you get $5 somewhere else in the system. I'm interested in how we match those things. And because then it becomes a real conversation about real liabilities. The current problem is those liabilities aren't being held by our water companies. Our mortgage holders aren't really pricing those liabilities in because everyone's in slightly la-la land around the climate risks that are talking about, or they're differentially pricing those risk liabilities. So I have to say more and more I've moved away from what I'd call the impact measurements to actually building the kind of relationships, the economic relationship between the liability owners and the beneficiaries to allow for a real conversation around that. So if you imagined Sheffield, there were 648 micro-urban forests built by communities. How could we have a new type of collective bargaining between the stewards of those forests with the water companies, with the other mortgage providers in Sheffield to say, look, we're reducing your liabilities basis point risk on the X. And I want to have those new forms of economic relationships rather than the social benefit relationships. And that does link into new forms of financing like GVA-based financing. So what's the economic growth that something drives? How can we measure it in different ways? How can we link return to that GVA impact? So I suppose we've slowly moved that way. I'm not saying we're right, but I just want to show where we've moved, not, you know, open to debate whether that's right or wrong, but just intuitively we've moved into that landscape.
Thank you, indeed. Thank you. Okay, so we have 3 minutes left, so we're going to have to do our closing comments very quickly. Sorry, 8 minutes left. Apologies. So I guess I'm going to go around. I'm going to ask, why Sheffield? Why is Sheffield a good place for the transitions that are coming, for learning about them, for experimenting them? Stephen, I appreciate you're not a Sheffield resident, although you have some Sheffield contacts, and same to you, Indy, of course, as well. But imagine, why Sheffield? I'm sure you both know a little bit about it. Helen, would you mind if I went to you first?
Yeah, I think just reflecting on the conversation, and the thing that struck me is the radical honesty point in time, a point in the process of learning and understanding and sense making, and that's a big point, isn't it? And I think as a city we are at a point where there's lots of things that are happening in the city that are I think a really ripe time for us to get really honest really quickly. And I think, you know, there's definitely those conversations happening. Part of them I hear about kind of, but collectively it just feels like, you know, is there a bit of a tipping point here, you know, given our political situation, given kind of recent reflective reports, you know, public reports about how we work as a city, how the council operate, how, you know, all the different actors in this isn't about any one organization, but there is a point at which, you know, that honesty, it just feels like collectively, and it's quite contagious. Once you start being really honest and calling stuff out, then it does grow, because you kind of that ripple effect. And that feels to me like the launching off point to then kind of, there's a lot of stress involved in that honesty, and moving past that stress into something that's more liberating, which is genuine curiosity, and not just trying to solve the things that are just in front of us, but getting beyond them. I don't know, again, it's instinct. There's something in my instinct, in my gut, that's telling me that it just feels like there's more of these conversations happening in the city, and there's willingness perhaps to get into that space.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you. Lou, over to you.
Yeah, I'd echo that. You know, Helen and I are fortunate enough to cross over in a few rooms, and there's been a massive step change in the last, I think probably since we've had a change in the chief exec at the local authority, a change with a new mayor in the mayoral combined authority. There is a different style of leadership, and it's more collaborative, it's more collegiate, and it's more progressive. And you can see that starting to make a difference. So that's great. But why Sheffield? Because we're like the home of loads of firsts, aren't we? We're, you know, a hotbed of innovation. We're pioneers. We were, you know, you look what we did way back, you know, with the Industrial Revolution. You know, we were made in Sheffield, round the world, still is. You know, we were suffragette movement, you know, was really instrumental here. It kicked off the first city of sanctuary before, you know, that was even really a thing that people were aware of. We were already a city of sanctuary. You know, we invent stuff, we try stuff, you know, we're the home of football, greenest city in Europe. You know, we've got the credentials, haven't we, to try and be fairer and greener and more inclusive and equitable. We've got all those ingredients here. And I think finally, the thing for me, the thing I love the most about Sheffield is it's big enough to have the institutions and everything there that you need, but it's small enough. You know, it's got that perfect balance of, you know it, James, from the rooms you're in, you don't have to be around Sheffield for very long to be connected to all the main players. And that's really good. There's a circle of, it's easy to create a circle of trust quite quickly in Sheffield, I think. And that's, you know, the foundation for everything really is circles of trust and relationships. And we've got that here. I just think people are pretty sound and want things to be better. So why not?
Thank you, Lou. Stephen, I'm going to go to you, and then Indy, if you could see us out. You've got 4 minutes between you, so if you could do 2 minutes each, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, I'll do it very quickly, but I'll start with my Sheffield credentials, because I was born in S5 in my grandma and granddad's house, and most of my family still live there. I mean, for me, why not? You know, I think Sheffield's a great place. We used to describe it as the biggest village in the country. And I think for that reason that there's a collective communal spirit very, very often. And I think it's set up. It's also, I think, culturally, people from Sheffield are radically honest. And I think we should build on that.
Thank you.
That's a minute, Indy. You've got 3.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you. Look, I'm an outsider from Sheffield, but what I would say is what you have is stuff like the Festival of Debate. The festival to have these conversations, this is a really critical asset. What you have is vast amounts of community groups that are actually participating in some of these conversations. What you have is a public authority leadership, which is actually wanting to be part of this. You have the public civic relationships in an extraordinary sense, and then you also have the creative economy. You also have the kind of the knowledge institutions and universities, albeit I want them to be radically transformed and improved in radical ways, like all universities across the UK. But I think you have the infrastructure to be able to demonstrate a next generation type of city, and you have the fundamental legitimacy between the public civic relationship to be able to build that story. And I think that is an extraordinary foundation for a legitimate transition of the city in a deep, powerful way. And I think that's a credit to what's possible. And we're going to need places like Sheffield to lead the way, because I think you have those ground foundations to be able to do it. James, to you for the last 2 minutes.
Wow.
Bring us home.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, all of you, for your contributions tonight. It's really expanded the way that I'm thinking about some of these questions, and I hope that's true of all the people listening online tonight as well. And of course, this recording will be available for people to view afterwards as well. I guess I'd just say that if you do watch this and you are interested in finding out how to do something, how to come to more of these conversations, how to assist with more topics, more interest in these key questions around how we respond to the challenges ahead, please do get in touch with us at Opus, info@weareopus.org, or get through to us via the festivalofdebate.com website. I just want to thank again all the speakers for tonight, because it's been really fantastic. And I wish you all well. Good night.